For many of you who don't know, I mean, I think most people think the census is about counting, and that's what I thought. It's really an exercise in counting before I started to do research. And I started to look back since 1790 of how we counted Americans along racial and ethnic lines. And back then it was color. And there was a controversy then, who should be counted? And should slaves who are black be counted the same as free whites? And because there's money involved and taxation involved, there was a big debate. The Northerners wanted slaves to be counted as the equivalent of free whites, and the Southerners didn't, and they agreed on a compromise that black slaves would be counted as 3/5 of a white person. So in that sense, the census not only cemented the color line, but reinforced how we thought of race, racial inequalities. And these categories have constantly changed, which is really fascinating. I was saying backstage that in 1850, we had a category mulatto to try to capture the amount of racial mixing between blacks and whites. In 1890, I believe, they added octoroon and quadroon to try to get at precise racial mixtures between blacks and whites. And then in 1930, because there was so much racial mixing, they actually dropped that altogether and just used black for anyone with any trace of black ancestry. And hence this idea of the one-drop rule, which has stayed so pervasive in the minds of Americans of who is black. And so as a result of all these practices, I think Americans have become very attuned to identifying blackness and constraining that racial category in ways.
And yet you said also in that year, 1930, that they added a category which I had never heard of.
Yeah, in 1930 alone, Mexican was listed as a racial category. And LULAC, which is the acronym, which escapes me now.
I'll help you. That's the League of United Latin American Citizens. It's one of the oldest Latino civil rights groups in the country, LULAC.
Thank you.
We're here
so they were very vehemently opposed to having Mexican as a separate racial category because that meant that Mexicans were not white. And LULAC, which was a very conservative organization at the time, was very adamant about this idea that Mexicans are white and should not be a separate color category and aligned with blacks or Chinese or other groups. And so because of their protests after 1930, they were never listed as a separate racial category. And I think in some ways, because of that, the boundaries surrounding Mexican are quite different.
Now, there's a certain irony when you look at how Latinos or Hispanics or whatever we're being called today are categorized today. You gentlemen want to talk about that? We were discussing that quite a bit.
Well, everybody will be asked two questions. Everybody will be asked to identify their race, and they'll have the options to identify themselves as either white, black, Asian, and there are a number of categories under that. Native American, where they can write in their tribe, or some other race, or any combination of the above. And everybody will also be asked to identify themselves if they're Hispanic or not, and then there'll be 4 check-off boxes. Are you, yes, Hispanic, Mexican, Puerto Rican, Cuban, or some other Hispanic, where people can write in their national origin.
Okay.
So that's asked of everybody in the country.
But you were saying that some people that you get all sorts of wild answers to that question.
Well, the thing is that in the sum of the race category, about half of Latinos do not identify as any of the above categories, neither white, black, Asian, or Native American, and they identify as some other race. The problem with that is that OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, does not recognize some other race as an official racial category. So even though you're allowed to be self-identify as some other race, the Census Bureau will go back and recode you into one of the categories above.